He thought turning her away would be routine, but within minutes, that decision would cost him everything. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The glass doors of the Grand Lexington Hotel slid open with a soft whisper, revealing a lobby bathed in warm golden light. Marble floors stretching across nearly 100 feet, reflecting crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations above. And in that carefully curated world of quiet luxury, Emily Carter stepped inside, her sneakers faintly squeaking against the polished surface, her gray hoodie slightly wrinkled from a long drive, her hair loosely tied back as if convenience mattered more than appearance. And almost instantly, the shift began, subtle at first, a receptionist pausing mid-keystroke, a bellhop glancing twice, a couple seated by the lounge exchanging a look that lasted just a second too long. Because in a place where every detail was designed to signal exclusivity, Emily didn't seem to fit the picture, yet she walked forward calmly, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady, as if she had every right to be there, which somehow made it worse for the people watching her, because confidence without visible status made them uncomfortable. And as she reached the front desk, the receptionist, a woman in a tailored navy suit with a name tag that read Vanessa, lifted her chin slightly before offering a smile that never reached her eyes. "Good evening. How can I help you?" Her tone polished but distant, and Emily responded gently. "Hi. I'd like a room for tonight, just one night." Her voice soft but clear, and for a brief moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to reveal judgment forming beneath professionalism. Vanessa's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but instead of typing, her gaze flicked up and down, taking in the hoodie, the worn denim, the lack of designer luggage, and something in her expression shifted. "I'm sorry," she said, the words coming too quickly. "We're fully booked," and behind her, a digital display still glowed faintly with the word vacancy, unnoticed by most but not by Emily, who simply nodded, not arguing, not reacting, just observing. "Are you sure?" she asked politely. And that was when the temperature in the room seemed to drop just a little, because now it wasn't just a request, it was resistance, however quiet, and Vanessa's smile tightened. "Yes, ma'am, we are," her voice firmer now, and a man standing nearby, dressed in a charcoal suit, turned slightly to watch, sensing something unfolding, and from the corner of the lobby, the floor manager began walking over, drawn by instinct more than necessity, because in places like this, anything that disrupts the illusion of perfection must be handled quickly, discreetly, and as Emily stood there, still calm, still composed, there was something about her stillness that didn't match the situation, something that suggested this moment wasn't unfolding the way it usually did, and though no one realized it yet, the quiet woman in the gray hoodie wasn't the one out of place, it was everyone else who had just made a very expensive mistake. The manager's shoes clicked sharply against the marble as he approached, each step measured, controlled, the kind of walk that carried authority long before any words were spoken, his name tag catching the light. Richard Hale, floor manager. And as he reached the desk, he did not look at Emily first. He looked at Vanessa, a silent exchange passing between them, one that said everything without a single word, and then he turned, offering Emily a smile that felt practiced, precise, and entirely. "Hello. Is there a problem here, ma'am?" he asked, his tone smooth but edged with impatience, and Emily met his gaze calmly, her eyes steady in a way that did not match the situation. "I was just asking for a room," she said, her voice even. "I was told you are fully booked," and Richard gave a short nod, as if confirming a fact that required no further discussion. "That is correct," he replied, clasping his hands lightly in front of him. "We are at full capacity this evening." And for a moment, everything seemed settled, like the scene would end the way it always did, the outsider dismissed, the order restored. But Emily did not move. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply glanced, just briefly, toward the illuminated panel behind the desk, the one still quietly displaying available rooms, and then back to him. "That sign says otherwise," she said softly. And the air shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, because now the performance was being questioned, and Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Those rooms are reserved," he answered quickly, "for our premium guests." And there it was, the line drawn. The invisible boundary made visible, a quiet declaration of who belonged and who did not. And a couple standing nearby turned their attention fully now, their conversation fading as curiosity took over, while a concierge at the far end pretended to organize papers, but listened closely, because moments like this rarely stayed contained. "I understand," Emily said, nodding slightly, her tone still polite, still composed. "And how do you determine who qualifies as a premium guest?" The question landed gently, but it carried weight, the kind that made people uncomfortable, not because it was aggressive, but because it was clear, and Richard exhaled through a faint smile, the kind used to maintain control. "We maintain certain standards," he replied, choosing his words carefully, "to ensure the experience our clientele expects." And as he spoke, his eyes flickered again, just for a second, toward her clothing, and that was enough. The message delivered without needing to be spoken aloud, and a quiet murmur passed through the small audience that had formed, not loud, but present, a ripple of shared understanding, or perhaps shared judgment. And still, Emily did not react the way they expected. No embarrassment, no defensiveness, just that same calm presence, as if she had stepped into this moment already knowing how it would unfold. "I see," she said, her voice thoughtful now, almost reflective, and then she added, "So this is not about availability. It is about appearance." And that was when the room truly fell silent, not completely, but enough that even the distant clink of glassware from the lounge seemed sharper, and Richard's posture stiffened, the polished professionalism beginning to crack at the edges. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice slightly, though it somehow carried further, "I would appreciate it if you did not mischaracterize our policies." And there was a subtle shift in his tone now, less patient, more directive. "If you do not have a reservation, I am going to have to ask you to step aside so we can assist other guests." And there it was, the escalation, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, a dismissal dressed as procedure. And for the first time, a few people looked away, uncomfortable with how public it had become, while others leaned in, drawn to the tension, and Emily stood there, still unmoving, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unreadable, and for a brief moment, it felt as if time itself paused, as if the entire lobby was holding its breath without realizing it, because something about her stillness did not belong to someone being turned away, it belonged to someone waiting, and though no one could explain why, a quiet unease began to settle over the room, like the first hint of a storm no one saw coming. Richard held his posture, firm and unmoving, convinced the moment was already over, because in his world, people like Emily always stepped aside eventually. They always lowered their eyes, mumbled something polite, and disappeared back through the glass doors, restoring the quiet order of the lobby. But Emily did none of that. She did not step aside. She did not retreat. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her breathing calm, as if the tension around her did not exist, and that was what unsettled him most. Not defiance, not anger, but composure, because composure meant control, and control meant this situation was not as simple as it appeared. "I believe I will wait here for a moment," Emily said gently, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without raising it, and Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest crack in an otherwise polished demeanor. "Ma'am, I am going to have to insist," he replied, this time less courteous, more authoritative, but before he could continue, the soft chime of the entrance doors echoed through the lobby once again. And something about the sound felt different, heavier somehow, as if it carried weight beyond its usual quiet presence, and several heads turned instinctively, including Richard's, his attention shifting just long enough to break the rhythm of the confrontation. And through the doorway stepped a man in a dark navy suit, tailored perfectly, his posture straight, his pace unhurried, each step measured with quiet confidence, and he did not look around like a guest admiring the space. He looked forward, directly ahead, his eyes scanning only long enough to locate exactly what he was looking for. And when his gaze found Emily, something in his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, a subtle tightening, a quiet recognition that replaced neutrality with purpose, and the air in the lobby shifted again, deeper this time, harder to ignore, because presence like that did not go unnoticed, not in a place built on status and perception, and Vanessa's fingers froze above the keyboard, while the concierge at the far end straightened instinctively, and even the couple by the lounge fell silent, sensing a change they could not yet explain, and Richard, still holding his ground, turned slightly toward the man, preparing to intercept, because that was his role, to control the flow, to manage the space, to ensure nothing disrupted the carefully constructed image of the hotel. But before he could speak, the man had already closed the distance, his steps quiet against the marble, yet somehow louder than anything else in the room, and he stopped just beside Emily, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, equal, deliberate, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, a silence stretching between them that felt less like hesitation and more like certainty. And then Emily turned her head slightly, her expression unchanged, her voice calm as ever. "You are here," she said, and the man nodded once, his gaze still forward, taking in Richard, the desk, the subtle tension written across every face in the room. "I am," he replied, his voice low, controlled, carrying a weight that did not need volume to command attention, and Richard cleared his throat, stepping forward again, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Sir, if you need assistance, I would be happy to help you," he said, his tone shifting instantly back to polished hospitality, the contrast almost immediate. But the man did not look at him right away. Instead, he glanced briefly at Emily, as if confirming something unspoken, and only then did he turn his attention to Richard, his expression unreadable, composed, the kind of calm that does not come from politeness but from authority. And when he finally spoke, it was not loud, not aggressive, just precise. "I believe she has already asked for assistance," he said, and in that moment, something invisible but undeniable cracked in the atmosphere, because for the first time since this began, the balance of the room had shifted, and though no one could fully explain why, it was suddenly very clear that the person standing quietly in a gray hoodie had never been the one without power, and the realization was only just beginning. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like something unseen had just entered the room and taken control without asking permission, and Richard felt it first, not in what was said, but in what was not, the absence of hesitation, the absence of explanation, the quiet certainty in the man's voice that made every carefully rehearsed response suddenly feel inadequate. And for a brief second, Richard hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he quickly masked it with professionalism. "Sir, I assure you, we have handled the situation appropriately," he said, his tone respectful now, measured, as if recalibrating in real time. And the man studied him for a moment, not aggressively, not even critically, just observing, the kind of observation that made people feel seen in ways they were not prepared for. And then he asked, "Appropriately?" The single word landing with more weight than a raised voice ever could, and Vanessa shifted, slightly behind the desk, her posture tightening, her fingers curling against the edge of the counter as if bracing for something she could not yet name, while a guest near the lounge slowly lowered his glass, no longer pretending not to listen, and Richard cleared his throat again, this time more carefully. "Yes, sir, we maintain strict policies regarding guest accommodations to ensure a certain standard," he explained, each word chosen with precision. But the explanation felt thinner now, less solid, as if it could not quite support the weight of the moment, and the man nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without agreeing to them, his gaze briefly moving to the illuminated vacancy sign behind the desk, then back to Richard. "So you have rooms available," he said calmly, not a question, but a statement, and Richard's composure faltered just enough to be noticed. "Those rooms are reserved," he repeated, though this time it sounded less like policy and more like justification. And the man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, a quiet clarity that made the distinction meaningless. "Reserved for whom?" he asked, and the question hung in the air, simple, direct. Impossible to deflect without revealing what everyone already suspected, and Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again, because any answer he gave would either contradict the facts or confirm the implication, and in that hesitation, the truth became louder than any explanation, and Emily remained beside him, still calm, still silent, her presence steady like an anchor in a room that was beginning to drift. And the man finally turned slightly toward her, his voice softening just a fraction. "Did they explain why?" he asked, and Emily shook her head gently. "They said they were full," she replied, her tone unchanged, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. And that was enough, more than enough, because it confirmed what he had already understood the moment he walked in, and he turned back to Richard, the calm in his expression now carrying something deeper, not anger, not frustration, but decision. "Then let me be clear," he said, his voice steady, measured, each word deliberate. "If there are rooms available, she will be given one." And there was no emphasis, no raised volume, no demand in the traditional sense, and yet it did not sound like a request. It sounded like a conclusion, as if the matter had already been decided somewhere beyond this conversation, and Richard felt it, the shift from negotiation to inevitability. But years of habit held him in place, his sense of authority resisting the change. "Sir, I do not believe you understand how our reservation system works," he began, attempting to reclaim control, but the man did not interrupt him, did not argue. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, slow, unhurried, and placed a small, unassuming card on the marble counter between them, and the motion itself was quiet, almost insignificant, but the effect was immediate. Vanessa's eyes dropped to the card, then widened slightly, her breath catching just enough to break the stillness, and Richard followed her gaze, his confidence dissolving in real time as recognition replaced assumption, because some things did not need explanation, some things spoke for themselves, and in that moment, the balance of the room did not just shift, it collapsed entirely, leaving only one question unspoken in the air, not who belonged there, but who had just made a mistake they could not undo. Vanessa's eyes remained fixed on the card, as if it had suddenly become too heavy to look at directly, her fingers hovering above it, but not daring to touch, and the color in her face drained slowly, replaced by something far less composed than the polished confidence she carried just moments ago, because recognition does not arrive loudly, it arrives quietly, unmistakably, and once it does, there is no pretending it did not happen, and Richard saw it in her reaction before he fully understood it himself. That subtle shift, that flicker of realization that passed from her expression into the space between them. And when he finally lowered his gaze to the card, everything changed, not all at once, but in a sequence so fast it felt like a single moment. His posture stiffened, his breath caught just slightly, and the carefully constructed authority he had been holding on to began to unravel, thread by thread, because the name printed on that card was not unfamiliar. It was impossible to misunderstand, and the logo beneath it carried more weight than any title he held, more than any policy he enforced. And suddenly the rules he had been so confident in did not seem like rules at all. They seemed like mistakes. "Sir," Richard began. But the word came out differently now, stripped of certainty, edged with hesitation, and the man did not interrupt him, did not raise his voice, did not demand anything further. He simply stood there, his presence unchanged, calm, grounded, absolute. And that calm became unbearable in its own way, because it left no room for excuses, no room for recovery, only acknowledgement. And around them, the lobby had shifted completely. Conversations had stopped entirely now, the quiet hum of activity replaced by a stillness that carried awareness, because people might not have known exactly what was happening, but they knew something had changed, something significant, and Vanessa finally moved, slowly, carefully, as if any sudden motion might make things worse. She picked up the card with both hands, her fingers slightly tense, and glanced at it again, as if hoping she had misread it the first time, but she had not. And when she looked up, her voice was no longer polished, it was cautious, almost fragile. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, the name landing in the air like a revelation, and Richard closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second, because now it was undeniable. The situation was no longer about a guest requesting a room. It was about a decision that had already crossed a line that could not be stepped back from. And Daniel Carter did not react to the recognition with satisfaction or anger. He simply acknowledged it with the smallest nod, as if this was not new to him, as if moments like this had played out before in different forms, different places, and he had learned that power did not need to announce itself. It only needed to exist. Yes, he replied calmly, his voice steady, and Richard straightened instinctively. But the movement felt forced now, his confidence replaced by something else entirely, something closer to urgency. "I apologize, sir. There must have been a misunderstanding," he said quickly, the words coming faster than before, as if speed could repair what had already been broken. But Daniel did not respond immediately. He let the silence sit, let the weight of the moment settle fully, because silence, in the right hands, says more than any apology ever could. And Emily remained beside him, unchanged, her calm presence now understood in a way it had not been before, because she had never been uncertain, never been out of place. She had simply been waiting, and Daniel finally spoke again, his tone even, not harsh, not forgiving, just clear. "There was no misunderstanding," he said, and the words landed with finality, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, and Richard felt it, the shift from apology to consequence, from explanation to accountability. And for the first time since this began, he realized this was not a moment he could manage, not a situation he could smooth over with the right words, because some actions do not need interpretation, they define themselves. And as the reality settled over him, the question was no longer how to fix the mistake, but how much it was going to cost. The word hung in the air long after Daniel spoke it, not loud, not sharp, but final in a way that left no space for reinterpretation, and Richard felt it settle deep in his chest, heavier than any raised voice could have been, because it was not anger he was facing, it was certainty, and certainty could not be negotiated with. It could not be softened or redirected. It simply existed, and in that moment, everything Richard had relied on, his authority, his experience, his instincts, felt suddenly fragile, like something built on assumptions that no longer held. "Of course, sir," he said quickly, his tone shifting again, now careful, controlled, almost urgent. "We will correct this immediately." And he turned slightly toward Vanessa, his voice dropping just enough to signal command without drawing attention. "Prepare a suite," he instructed, "our best available." But even as he spoke, he knew it was not enough, because this was no longer about providing a room. It was about undoing a moment that had already happened, and Daniel remained still, watching, not interrupting, not acknowledging the effort, simply observing as if measuring something far beyond the surface. And Emily stood beside him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if this entire shift had been expected, not surprising. And that realization unsettled Richard more than anything else, because it meant the power in this moment had never been introduced. It had been there from the beginning, unnoticed, dismissed, and now impossible to ignore. "Actually," Daniel said quietly, and the single word stopped Richard mid-motion. "That will not be necessary." And Richard froze, confusion flickering across his face, because refusal was not the response he had prepared for, not the direction he had anticipated. "Sir?" he asked, uncertain now. And Daniel's gaze moved briefly across the lobby, taking in the silent onlookers, the staff standing just a little straighter, the tension that had replaced the earlier judgment. And then he looked back at Richard, his expression unchanged. "A room is not the issue," he said, his tone calm, deliberate. "The issue is how this situation was handled before I arrived." And there was no accusation in his voice, no raised edge, but the meaning was unmistakable, and Richard felt the weight of it settle, heavier than before, because now it was not about service, it was about accountability. And Vanessa lowered her eyes slightly, her hands clasped together in front of her, the confidence she had carried earlier replaced by something quieter, more cautious. And the lobby remained still, every small movement amplified by the silence, every breath measured, because everyone understood now that this moment was no longer private. It had become something else, something that would define more than just a single interaction. And Daniel continued, his voice steady. "Tell me," he said, looking directly at Richard. Is this how your team is trained to treat guests? And the question was simple, but it carried a weight that pressed down on the entire space, because there was no correct answer, only honest ones, and Richard hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough to reveal everything. No, sir, he admitted finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance. It is not. And Daniel nodded slightly, not satisfied, not displeased, just acknowledging the truth, and he glanced once more at Emily, as if confirming something silently, before returning his attention to Richard. Then we have a larger problem than a reservation, he said, and the words settled like a quiet verdict, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but absolute. And for the first time since the moment began, Richard understood that what was about to happen would not be resolved with a simple correction. It would require something deeper, something structural. Because when respect is compromised, the consequences do not stay contained. They spread, they reveal, and they demand to be addressed. And as that realization took hold, the marble floors beneath them seemed colder somehow, the polished surface reflecting not just light, but the unmistakable truth that this was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a turning point. The words lingered in the air, heavier now, no longer just a conversation, but a quiet dismantling of everything that had happened before, and Richard felt it fully for the first time, not as a moment he could recover from, but as one he would be remembered for, and that realization settled deep, tightening his posture, slowing his breath, forcing him to confront something far more uncomfortable than being wrong. The fact that he had been certain while being wrong, and across from him, Daniel, did not move, did not press, did not escalate, because he did not need to. The shift had already happened, the room already understood, and the silence now carried something new, not tension, but awareness, the kind that spreads quietly from one person to another until it fills the entire space. And Vanessa stood still behind the desk, her earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a careful stillness, as if any sudden motion might make the situation worse. And in that stillness, something else began to surface, not fear, not exactly, but recognition, the understanding that this was not about a single guest or a single mistake. It was about a pattern that had just been exposed in the worst possible way. And Daniel's gaze moved slowly across the lobby, taking in the people who had watched, the staff who had hesitated, the environment that had allowed the moment to unfold exactly as it had. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was a clarity in it now that felt sharper, more defined. Who made the decision to deny her a room? He asked, and the question landed directly, leaving no room to shift. Responsibility, no space to hide behind procedure, and Richard felt it immediately, the focus narrowing, the accountability becoming specific, unavoidable. I did, he answered after a brief pause, his voice steady but quieter than before, stripped of authority, grounded in fact, and Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the answer without reaction, as if this confirmation simply aligned with what he had already expected, and then he asked, based on what? And again, the question was simple, but it cut deeper, because now it was not just about the action, it was about the reasoning behind it, the assumptions that led to it, and Richard hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he did, and saying it out loud would make it undeniable. Based on our standards, he said carefully, the words sounding less certain as they left his mouth, and Daniel held his gaze, not challenging, not interrupting, just allowing the answer to exist fully in the space between them, and in that moment, the flaw in the reasoning became visible to everyone, not because it was pointed out, but because it could not withstand the weight of the question, and a quiet shift moved through the onlookers, subtle but present, as understanding replaced assumption, and Emily remained beside him, her presence unchanged, her silence now carrying meaning, because she had never needed to argue, never needed to defend herself. The truth of the situation had revealed itself on its own, and Daniel finally spoke again, his tone measured, deliberate. Standards should define quality, he said, not exclusion, and the sentence settled into the room like a line drawn in clear view of everyone present, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable, and Richard lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because there was no response that could reshape what had already been exposed. And Daniel continued, not raising his voice, not addressing the room, but speaking in a way that reached everyone anyway. If your standards allow this, he said, then they are not protecting your guests, they are misrepresenting your values. And the words did not echo, but they lingered, embedding themselves into the space, into the people, into the moment itself. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the focus shifted completely away from Emily, away from whether she belonged, and towards something much larger, something structural, something that could not be ignored or dismissed. And Richard understood it now, fully, not just the mistake, but the consequence, not just what had happened, but what it revealed. And as he stood there, the polished image of the hotel around him suddenly felt different, not elevated, not exclusive, but exposed. Because the real measure of a place is not how it treats those who clearly belong, but how it treats those it assumes do not. And in that moment, the truth of that measure had been made visible to everyone in the room. The silence that followed his words did not break. It deepened, settling into every corner of the lobby like something permanent, something that could not be undone simply by moving on. And Richard felt it pressing against him, not from Daniel, not from Emily, but from the weight of being seen clearly for the first time in a situation he could not control. And in that clarity, something shifted inside him, not outwardly dramatic, but unmistakable, a recognition that this moment required more than composure, more than apology. It required action, and not the kind that restores appearance, but the kind that corrects reality. And Daniel remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. But his presence now carried something final, something that suggested the next step would not be requested, it would be expected. And after a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice even, deliberate. Effective immediately, I want a full review of this location's guest handling procedures, he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and the words moved through the room like a quiet command, not directed only at Richard, but at the entire system that had allowed this moment to happen. And Richard nodded quickly, almost instinctively. Yes, sir, he replied, his tone now fully aligned with the reality in front of him, stripped of resistance, focused entirely on response. And Daniel continued, his gaze steady. I also want every staff member retrained on what service actually means, he added. Not just protocol, but judgment. And Vanessa's shoulders tensed slightly at the word, because she understood, as did everyone else, that this was not about memorizing procedures. It was about correcting perception, and Daniel's voice remained calm, but there was something deeper in it now, something rooted in principle rather than reaction. If someone walks through those doors, he said, they are a guest first, not a profile. And the sentence settled into the space like a quiet correction of everything that had just been revealed. And for a moment, no one moved, because the shift was no longer subtle, it was complete. The hierarchy of the room had been redefined without a single raised voice. And Richard straightened slightly, not in authority, but in acknowledgement. Understood, he said, his voice steady now, grounded in something more real than before. And Daniel gave a small nod, as if confirming that the response matched the expectation. And then, finally, he turned slightly toward Emily, his expression softening just enough to be noticed. Would you still like a room? He asked, and the question, simple as it was, carried a different weight now, because it was no longer about access, it was about choice. And Emily paused for just a second, her gaze moving briefly across the lobby, taking in the people who had watched, the staff who now stood differently, the space that had shifted around her without her ever needing to change herself. And then she looked back at him, her expression calm, thoughtful. Yes, she said quietly, but only if it is offered with respect. And the words, gentle and measured, carried more power than anything spoken before, because they defined the condition that had been missing from the beginning. And Daniel nodded once, not surprised, not challenged, simply aligned. And he turned back to Richard, his voice steady. Then make sure it is, he said. And this time, there was no hesitation in the response. It will be, Richard answered, his tone clear, certain in a way that did not rely on authority, but on understanding. And as Vanessa moved to prepare the room, her movements careful, deliberate, the lobby slowly began to breathe again. But it was not the same as before. The silence had changed something, revealed something, and though the marble floors still reflected the same golden light, the meaning behind what had just happened lingered, quiet but undeniable, because respect, once tested, does not return unnoticed. It leaves behind a standard that cannot be ignored. Vanessa's hands moved carefully across the keyboard, each keystroke deliberate, precise, as if the act of entering the reservation now carried more weight than it ever had before, and the screen reflected softly in her eyes as she worked, no longer rushing, no longer assuming, but paying attention in a way that had been missing just moments ago. And Richard stood beside the desk, not directing, not correcting, simply present. His posture no longer rigid with authority, but grounded in awareness. The kind that comes only after a moment you cannot ignore, and the guests who had watched began to shift slowly, some returning to their conversations, others lingering just a second longer, as if trying to fully understand what they had just witnessed, because something had changed, not just in the interaction, but in the space itself, and Emily remained where she was, calm, composed, her presence unchanged from the moment she walked in, and that constancy now stood in quiet contrast to everything around her that had shifted, and Daniel stood beside her, his gaze relaxed now, no longer assessing, no longer measuring, because the outcome had already been set in motion, and after a few seconds, Vanessa looked up, her voice steady but softer than before. "Your suite is ready, Miss Carter," she said, and the difference in her tone was unmistakable, not just polite, but respectful, and Emily nodded gently, acknowledging the effort without exaggeration. "Thank you," she replied, her voice as calm as ever, and for a brief moment, the simplicity of the exchange carried more meaning than anything that had come before, because respect, once missing, becomes visible when it is finally present, and Richard stepped forward slightly, not out of obligation, but with intention. "If there is anything else we can do to make your stay comfortable, please let us know," he said, and this time, there was no performance in his words, no assumption beneath them, only sincerity shaped by understanding, and Emily met his gaze, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with clarity. "There is," she said quietly, and Richard straightened instinctively, ready to respond. "Make sure the next person who walks in here does not have to stand where I did," she continued, her tone gentle but firm, and the words settled into him deeper than any instruction Daniel had given, because they did not come from authority, they came from experience, and that made them impossible to dismiss. And Richard nodded once, slowly. "It will not happen again," he said, and for the first time it sounded like a promise rather than a correction, and Daniel glanced at Emily briefly, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, and then he turned toward the elevators, his movement calm, unhurried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and Emily followed beside him, her steps steady against the marble floor, the same quiet rhythm as when she had entered, but now the space around her had changed, not because she had changed, but because the room had finally understood who she was all along. And as the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, they stepped inside without looking back, and the lobby, once filled with quiet judgment, now held something else entirely, something more aware, more careful, as if every person present had just been reminded of a truth they already knew but had forgotten to practice. And as the doors closed, the reflection of the golden lights faded from view, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, not empty, not tense, but reflective, as if the moment would stay there long after they were gone. And somewhere between the polished floors and the quiet conversations that slowly returned, the lesson remained, clear and unspoken, that dignity does not announce itself. It reveals itself when it is tested, and those who fail to recognize it are the ones who lose the most. Respect is always revealed when you least expect it. If you believe in stories that uncover truth and dignity, hit like and subscribe because the next story might change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching.